this wouldn't even be an issue if we weren't dependent on fossil fuels, right?
On March 8th, President Biden signed an executive order banning the import of Russian oil, liquefied natural gas, and coal to the United States. Russian imports only account for a small portion of the energy used in the United States. But still, in this time of rising prices, including rising gas prices, this will have an impact on Americans' wallets. It may well be for the best geopolitically, but it will cost you more. Meanwhile, European Union nations, especially Germany, the EU's largest economy, have placed sanctions on Russia as well. And while they're still buying Russian natural gas, plans to reduce their consumption and switch to alternatives are apparently in the works. The motivation here should be obvious. Russia, which invaded another sovereign nation last February, is a petrostate. Stop buying their biggest and most lucrative exports, and they won't be able to finance their war effort. Or much of anything else for that matter, including potential future war efforts. Hopefully, these sanctions will help bring about an end to this conflict sooner rather than later. Though, they could always have the opposite effect, and make Putin all the more aggressive. I guess we'll see. In response to this, our friends on the left have renewed their calls for switching American energy to renewables. Not only are they cleaner than fossil fuels, considering that we get lots of our energy from suspect regimes, converting to renewables like wind and solar will take power and geopolitical leverage away from oil-rich nations like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, among others.
This wouldn't even be an issue if we weren't dependent on fossil fuels, right? If Democrats, like Joe Biden, for instance, focused on pivoting toward renewable energy decades ago, instead of sucking up to corporate interests, instead of providing oil companies more government subsidies, maybe they should have focused on developing renewable energy in this country and getting us off of oil dependence. That would have been pretty nice. Then we wouldn't be struggling with persuading other oil-producing countries to help us out.
To their credit, they at least know that we cannot do this immediately. So I have heard some of them call for ramped up domestic energy in the interim, which I certainly support, but 100% renewables is their goal over the long run. Now, before I begin as to why I think that's not only not a viable option, but in fact would be counterproductive in many ways, let me start off with a concession. Yes, our dependence on fossil fuels does entangle us with some bad actors on the world stage, and that's a problem that shouldn't be ignored. It is a drawback of fossil fuels that our consumption of them puts money in the hands of some pretty bad people in the Middle East, Latin America, and yes, Russia. My problem with the energy conversation is how one-sided it is. Yes, there are drawbacks to fossil fuels, including geopolitical ones. There are also enormous benefits to using them, not just for greedy oil executives, but also for totally normal people. We also never seem to talk about the downsides on the other side of the ledger. Yes, even sources of energy like wind and solar have some serious drawbacks, including, as we'll see, geopolitical ones. First off, the big reason why switching over to green energy simply isn't a solution right now is because they're simply not as reliable as fossil fuels. As Daniel Yergin writes in the new map, Energy, Climate, and the Clash of Nations, solar and wind have become the chosen vehicles for decarbonizing electricity. Once alternatives, they are now mainstream. Yet, as their share of generation grows larger, they confront the challenge of intermittency. They can flood the grid with electricity when the sun shines and the wind blows, but then almost disappear when the day is cloudy or there is only a murmuring breeze. This points to major technological challenges to maintain grid stability and find ways to store electricity at large scale for periods longer than a few hours. Of course, technology can change, and maybe it will, but for now, green energy simply isn't as reliable as fossil fuels. This is one of the things I appreciate about the film Planet of the Humans. The film is certainly not pro-capitalism or pro-fossil fuels, and I definitely don't agree with the implied conclusion. But it does a good job of showing some of the downsides associated with green energy, including the problem of intermittency. They show that lots of these supposed green energy power plants use fossil fuels as backups, precisely because green energy sources are not reliable enough to stand on their own.
Instead of using energy generated by coal-fired power plants, the solar farm will now avoid about 2.1 million pounds of carbon pollution.
But then they're building a larger natural gas plant. This is a 650 megawatt natural gas plant. That's 4 times more megawatts than the coal plant over there that it's replacing. And they're doing the same thing in North Carolina, which was the subject of that Years of Living Dangerously series.
Duke Energy operates a coal plant right outside of Asheville that is the biggest source of climate pollution in western North Carolina. And we are working to retire that plant and replace it with clean energy.
But what they don't tell you is that we're also building a larger natural gas facility.
Here in the United States, we just sort of take for granted that we have electricity available to us at all hours of the day, and that it's relatively affordable. I remember once on Twitter I complained about setting the clock on my microwave, which is weirdly difficult to do on my unit for some reason, and one of my followers told me how lucky I am to be able to leave appliances plugged in like that when I'm not using them, and to not think anything of it. There are lots of places in the world where people have to be way more conscientious of how they use their energy. The benefits of fossil fuels extend to much more important things, of course, and are not just afforded to the upper crust of society. In fact, the biggest improvements in the quality of life are realized by the poorest among us. Alex Epstein gives an excellent anecdote of what life is like without fossil fuels in his book, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels.
At 4 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, I was startled when the lights came on. The lights never came on after 2 p.m. on the weekends. The adrenaline really kicked in when I was invited to observe an emergency cesarean section, a first for me. When the infant emerged, I felt my heart racing from excitement and awe. But no matter how many times the technician suctioned out the nose and mouth, the infant did not utter a sound. After 25 minutes, the technician and nurse both gave up. The surgeon later explained that the baby had suffocated in utero. If only they had had enough power to use the ultrasound machine for each pregnancy, he would have detected the problem earlier and been able to plan the C-section. Without early detection, the C-section became an emergency. Moreover, the surgery had to wait for the generator to be powered on. The loss of precious minutes meant the loss of a precious life.
It's no coincidence that the massive gains in wealth and development in formerly destitute countries like China and India have coincided with massive increases in their use of fossil fuels. Affordable, reliable energy has enabled so many of their poor citizens to improve their standards of living in ways once thought impossible. Converting to 100% renewables is something that only wealthy nations have the luxury of aspiring to, and for them it's still not realistic. One of the major initiatives of the European Union, with Germany leading the way, was the big push for decarbonization. The rationale for this approach was to mitigate the effects of climate change and to decouple energy ties from the Middle East, the latter of which became a big priority following the US-led invasion of Iraq, which Germany opposed. Both of these goals are perfectly understandable, and I'm sure they were crafted with the best of intentions. Of course, having good intentions doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get good results. Germany's policy of Energiewende, I think I'm pronouncing that right, which translates to energy turn, provided extensive subsidies for solar and wind. These subsidies only increased in 2011, after Japan was hit with a massive tsunami, which damaged their nuclear power plants, leaking radiation into surrounding water. Germany started to abandon their own nuclear power plants in response to this, increasing the pace at which they were converting to renewables. On paper, the decarbonization plan seems to be chugging along just fine. But, as always, the devil is in the details. According to Jürgen, by 2019, 33% of Germany's electricity came from renewables. But it had not come cheaply. Germany's Federal Court of Auditors criticized government ministries for exerting no oversight over the financial impact of the energy turn, for not asking how much should the energy turn cost the state, and failing to take into account reliability and affordability. To help keep energy prices down, and to help keep the lights on when the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, Germany has imported fossil fuels, specifically natural gas, almost all of which comes from Russia. In fact, after former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder left office, he helped broker a deal with the Russian oil company Gazprom for increased imports. His efforts were instrumental in the construction of the Nord Stream pipeline, which ships natural gas. Schroeder was given a cushy €250,000 a year position with the company, and has since lobbied for a second Nord Stream pipeline. One of the notable qualities of the original Nord Stream pipeline is that most of it was built underwater, rather than over land. This made the project considerably more expensive than it otherwise would have been. The significance here is that it directly connects Germany to Russia, two countries that do not actually physically border each other. Upon its construction, then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev stated that its construction meets our long-term goals. What goals was he referring to exactly? Well, the alternative was to build the pipeline over land, likely over Ukraine. Eastern European countries are significantly more skeptical of taking Russian energy, precisely because they know it gives Russia leverage. As James Kirkchuk wrote in The End of Europe, Dictators, Demagogues, and the Coming Dark Age, by traveling straight from Russia to Germany via the Baltic Sea, and bypassing the countries in between, Nord Stream allows the Kremlin to halt energy supplies to Central and Eastern Europe, while keeping the gas flowing to Germany and beyond. Over the past decade, Russia has repeatedly shut off gas supplies to Europe as a way of exacting political influence, and Nord Stream has enhanced its leverage. This is an act of separating Central and Western Europe from its neighbors in the East, while keeping Russian coffers full with revenue from the gas. Thanks to the unreliability of green energy sources, German demand for Russian gas has only increased. While some Europeans have grumbled in the face of this use of Nord Stream, Russia remained defiant. In 2011, at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum, Gazprom CEO Alexei Miller told a group of European business leaders and diplomats to get over your fear of Russia or run out of gas. It's also worth bringing up that the world's largest producer of solar panels is China, an authoritarian state with its own human rights abuses. A lot of euros went into Chinese pockets thanks to these green energy initiatives. China has been credibly accused of using slave labor to build solar panels, most notably from their Uyghur concentration camps. The United States has actually banned some of these imports for this very reason. This is only scratching the surface of the ways in which green energy ties developed nations to rogue regimes, immoral labor practices, and environmental degradation. Even if we lived in a world where nations no longer competed with one another over fossil fuels, there would still be competition over other scarce resources, including resources necessary for building green energy infrastructure. For example, batteries for electric cars use cobalt, which is currently being mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo with child labor, much of it funded with Chinese capital. My goal here is not to pick on green energy. As I said earlier, fossil fuels have plenty of trade-offs, both geopolitical and environmental. They also have tremendous upsides. Green energy also has many of these downsides. They just don't come up as often. Furthermore, they don't have nearly the upsides that fossil fuels do, at least not now. Technology is constantly changing, and it may make energy resources like wind and solar preferable to fossil fuels, but that simply isn't the case right now. You're free to advocate for green energy all you like, but we have to be realistic about it. Even if we abandoned fossil fuels entirely, that wouldn't end our relationship with rogue regimes around the world.